So I've become obsessed with learning about Mexico recently, or Los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, which is to the south of the United States of America. And I'll often refer to these as the United States and Mexico, though these names obviously are complicated, and we just get in the habit of saying certain things. And we like to imagine this border means something. And it's been in place for quite a while, but is also somewhat arbitrary. Sometimes defined by natural features such as the Rio Grande, or El Rio Bravo del Norte, and sometimes just arbitrary lines drawn through the desert. Here's what North America looks like from space. And we can see things like desert, or mountain ranges, or green areas, and so on, as well as coastlines. And there were people here already when the Europeans came. But the borders we're talking about today were defined by Europeans who conquered the land, and by the successor states following independence from Europe, often with little to no regard for the people already living here. And so looking at the north of Mexico, aka the United States of America, we see a variety of borders that existed over time, and at times were the border with Mexico and have influenced the Mexican border of today. We see things like the Louisiana Purchase or the Oregon Territory, or names like Spain, Mexico, Texas, Florida that we still recognize. Also worth pointing out that Russia had an influence not just in Alaska, but also down the Pacific coast to some extent. Anyway, looking a little bit more at Spain. This is a map circa 1790 of the Spanish and Portuguese empires. And this is after the independence of the United States, where we have regions with territorial dispute between the UK and Spain, and we have a Louisiana controlled by Spain as well. Or in this map of New Spain, we see also Louisiana controlled by Spain, along with Alta and Baja California, and the New Philippines. I'm not sure make Texas New Philippines again would fly very well for a politician. So the question I have for the moment is, what's the deal with Louisiana? Well, New France had quite a large territory in North America at one point. This right here is 1712. And in 1762, under the Treaty of Fontainebleau, if I pronounced that right, France ceded Louisiana to Spain. Notice these things are happening quickly. During the lifespan of a person, multiple of these events took place. And then in 1801, under the Treaty of Aranjuez, Spain gave Louisiana back to France. For only 2 years later, France to sell Louisiana to the United States, which formed a big portion of the border between the United States and Spain. And in the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819, we see a more formalized border between New Spain and the United States. And an 1818 treaty with Britain also drew a straighter line boundary between the UK and the US, with Oregon Territory still shared between US and Britain. And in this Adams-Onís Treaty, the US also got Florida from Spain. And note this Adams here is John Quincy Adams. But meanwhile, this did not stay Spain for long, because Mexico had already declared independence earlier, and in 1821 won their independence from Spain, and quickly became the first Mexican empire, called first because there was a brief second empire some decades later. Central America / Guatemala had also declared independence from Spain in 1821, and quickly joined the Mexican Empire, which gave Mexico a border with the US and/or UK on the north, and down to Great Colombia on the south. And the Republic of Colombia, sometimes called Gran Colombia, and Gran Colombia of that time consists of what's today Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and other things, more or less. So once upon a time, Mexico bordered with Colombia. But that Mexican empire fell apart real quick, and Central America chose to go its own way, except for Chiapas that stayed along with Mexico, as Mexico officially became a republic at this time, or the United Mexican States. And here's a map from 1828 of Mexico, where they spell Mexico with a J in this particular map. And some of the geographic features here are wrong, such as this lovely river pouring from Salt Lake out to the ocean. But I'm sure they were trying. And then meanwhile, we have the history of Texas, with Americans that moved in under agreements with Mexico, and then later rebelled against Mexico, where slavery is an important part of the question. These were Southerners from the US who had slaves, and Mexico had made slavery illegal. There are other issues here as well, and we'll have to look more at that in the future. But something I'd never heard of before until I was looking at these maps was the Republic of Rio Grande, which I'm not sure was ever recognized by Mexico, though it had declared some independence and didn't last for long at all. However, not long later, there was the Republic of Yucatan, although Yucatan also didn't last long as an independent republic either. There was a Maya uprising that they wanted to put down, and for help from Mexico, they agreed to go back to being a part of Mexico. But meanwhile, our Federal Republic of Central America, that had been ongoing for a while since the end of the Mexican Empire, broke down under his own internal conflicts, and this country broke into the countries we know today of Central America. But somewhere in the process of this, Guatemala lost the area of Soconusco, and Chiapas became bigger, and Guatemala became smaller. And from here we see the current border between western Guatemala and southern Mexico. And meanwhile, Texas had joined the United States. Note here that Texas had declared quite a bit of territory to themselves, although this was never really agreed upon between Mexico and Texas. And I suspect these diagonal lines here are just representing that lack of agreement on exactly where those borders were. But this wasn't a question for long, because not long after we had the Mexican-American War, which we'll also have to look at more in the future. But under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the U.S. got much of its current shape. And another thing we'll have to look into in the future is, when America conquered Mexico, why didn't they just annex all of Mexico? Topic for the future. Meanwhile, we see here that Yucatan did join back to Mexico eventually. And in 1853, we had the Gadsden Purchase from the U.S., which forms the current border, which are much more straight lines than what was there before, carving off especially this chunk of the Mexican state of Sonora, grabbing and including the city that I've lived in the past more than 7 years of Tucson. And Sonoran culture and cuisine and people continue strong in Tucson to this day. So, skipping ahead a lot of years, without much change in borders on the outside, we see Mexico as it exists today, including these straight line borders that carve up in rather unnatural ways the area that was there before. And here in the south, we also see a more defined border between Mexico and what is Guatemala and Belize. For much of these maps, they had this sort of dashed line area here. And I think this is at least related to what happened with Belize. Even from Spain times and all through Mexico, the UK had a logging operation here on this coastline. Sometimes with permission, sometimes without permission, sometimes they were present, sometimes they were kicked out. It's complicated. But this area was known as British Honduras, and Britain had an interest in this area because of their logging and did not like to give up on it. This map here is from 1961. It's not long after that UK gave independence to this area and became the Belize or Belize that we know today. However, just like Spain had never quite really just given this territory to Britain, Guatemala also continued to claim this region, and the dispute over the territory continues to this day. So, here we're back to our original maps. We have Mexico here, with the USA on the north, and Guatemala and Belize on the south. And a lot more to do looking at in the middle of Mexico in the future as well, including all of these Mexican states. And it could be I got a lot of things wrong here. I'm learning this as I'm going. But before we're done, let's take a quick look at some of the people who are already living here when the Europeans came. There's a lot of names here, and I recognize only some of them. But in my region of Tucson and across the border into Sonora, we have the Tohono O'odham people, whose lands were divided by the Gadsden Purchase, although continue to live as a people across the border, and have been greatly impacted by the construction of border wall between the US and Mexico. And further here to the south, where I lived for a while in western Guatemala once upon a time, we see the Mam people, who are split between the Mexico and Guatemalan borders. And these are real people with real consequences from the external political entities that try dividing lines and enforcing laws. And many other people groups exist across all this land as well. And at some point I want to do a bit of a comparison and study between the peoples here and say what kind of statistics we see difference between here and say people groups of Middle Ages or ancient Europe, where we may or may not have different familiarity with people names of different regions based on our own background. Anyway, hopefully I can study more of this and share some of what I learned in the future. Bye y'all.